Hi, my name is Steve Mitchell. I'm a geologist and I'm a Christian. And I want to talk today about some of the claims that young Earth creationists use to support their interpretation of Genesis 1. In this particular version, I'm going to do it a little bit shorter because I'm going to leave out some of the introductory materials that I used when I gave this in the longer version and when I presented this for Reasons to Believe's Houston chapter. In other words, I'm not going to talk about different perspectives that Christians have on the book of Genesis. Instead, I'm going to go directly into the evidence, and we'll take a look at dinosaurs and what they tell us. We'll take a look at the evidence that young Earth creationists have claimed for dinosaur tracks mixed with human tracks, and that soft tissue that scientists have discovered actually demonstrates that the Earth is young. And we'll take a look at that claim. We'll also take a look at radiometric dating and of course, in general, this is interpreted by most scientists as pointing to a very ancient Earth and a very ancient universe. Young Earth creationists make the claim that they find carbon-14 in diamonds and that's proving that the Earth is young. So they make claims that the Earth's tectonic plates actually have moved very quickly, and we'll take a look at that and see how radiometric dating fits into that story. So with that, we'll begin. We're going to look at some of the lines of evidence that young Earth creationists use to say that the Earth is young. And a lot of things which they point to are reasons or excuses why they believe that the evidence which shows that the Earth is old actually isn't valid. But if you ask them for positive evidence, say, what actually shows the Earth is young, here's a couple of lines that are often used. And one relates to dinosaurs. A lot of us like dinosaurs. I like to go to the Houston Museum of Natural Science and see the magnificent skeletons of these dinosaurs there. They're amazing creatures. To me, it's amazing that the idea that the young Earth creation model says is that God created these creatures to exist for just a very short period of time. In other words, in their model, they would have all lived for a period of less than 2,000 years. And that's kind of strange. It sounds almost like they're saying God was a bad planner because he went to all of this trouble to create all of these magnificent creatures only to see them destroyed in an event that he knew was coming. But we don't have to believe that. That's not what the Bible actually tells us. Let's take a look at what evidence is referred to show that the Earth is young. We're going to look at some dinosaur tracks. And on this map, this shows Texas, it shows New Mexico, northern Mexico, and a lot of dinosaur tracks that are found in here, reaching down from the center around this green area, the Cretaceous or Mesozoic rock in here. South and west of Glen Rose, Texas, is a place called Dinosaur Valley State Park. And it's in this area that young Earth creationists have in the past said that there were dinosaur tracks that are found with human tracks. So they were formed at the same time. And that really would be surprising. I mean, geologists are saying that the dinosaurs died 65 million years ago and that humans arose just a few thousand years ago. So obviously in that context, they would never mix. Young Earth creationists often claim that there actually are these tracks together. And that would be a real surprise from a geologist standpoint. Take a look at some tracks that are claimed to be actually human footprints in this area. And one of these is in the upper left in this photo. And obviously it looks very human at first glance. Well, let's take a look at some of these. First, you need to kind of look at where these fall in the geologic record. And we'll talk about that in terms of the stratigraphic column. We'll look at it from a young Earth creation standpoint and also from a more conventional geologic understanding. So we'll look at that first on the left where the rock and the rocks laid down in the order that young Earth creation predicts that they would be there. In other words, if in one place you had rocks deposited continuously from the time of creation all the way to the present, it would form a series of layers on it. It includes at the base of it those rocks which God created during the initial creation. So they would appear as old, even though they are not old, but they were created mature, as the terminology that the young Earth creationists might use. And then you would have rocks that were deposited between the time of creation and the time of the Great Flood. So this would be during the time of Adam all the way up to Noah. And this is in the biblical chronology that they accept around 1656 years. There's different different dates that are sometimes given. But if there's no gaps, that's what you would have. It'd be just less than 2,000 years. And then you would have a 1-year flood deposit. And then that would be followed by deposits after the flood. And I've divided those up into those that were after the time of Abraham in the pink and the upper area 5, and those which were before Abraham. So between Noah and the time of Abraham, this would be 4. Now that period would be around 300 to 500 years, depending on when you say Abraham lived. So on the right, what we see is the more standard geological sequences that we find rocks described at by geologists. Now, most young Earth creationists who have a geologic background recognize that these are valid. They tell you the order of the rocks were formed, and even that they would dispute the amount of time that's involved in that. So they're seeing a different time frame over for the same type of order of rocks. So this is described in terms of a series of periods, starting at the base of the Cambrian period, and then the Ordovician period, and a series of periods all the way up to the present. The period where the dinosaurs lived is kind of these near the top of it, the periods which are labeled the Triassic, the Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods. The dinosaur tracks that we're going to look at are from the Glen Rose tracks initially, and conventional geology would say that those are 110 million years old, and they would be in what's called the Lower Cretaceous period in this time. We look at some tracks that are younger than that, which were formed in Utah in what's called the Blackhawk Formation there, and they would be around 75 million years. So in a conventional geologic manner. Now, what would a young Earth creationist say about how these were formed and when they were formed in relation to Noah's flood? The picture that's here is based on the book Carved in Stone by Dr. Tim Clary. And what he has done is in his model, all of these would be formed in this period of time called the covering the highest hills, this period near the very peak of the flood. Now, there's another model that creationists have, which would say that this is later in that kind of receding phase. But all young Earth creationists that I've read about would say that these were all formed in the Cretaceous period, but the Cretaceous period was all part of Noah's flood. So you had dinosaurs walking around at either the peak of the flood or near the end of the flood. And I find that really hard to explain to me. It's hard for me to understand why would we have dinosaurs out walking around. And it's not like they're walking out on pre-flood rocks. They're walking out in Glen Rose, where you've got 8,000 feet of flood sediment in their model down below them. So you had 8,000 feet of Paleozoic and Mesozoic rock. All of this rock in between this base from the Cambrian from up to the Cretaceous period. And then on top of that, you have dinosaurs out wandering around. And to me, that's hard to understand. It's not evident at all that these are running from any flood or anything like that. So that's hard for me to explain. Well, let's take a look at what they report and what happens or what we do find in Glen Rose, Texas. Find here a photograph of Glenn Cuban on the right. He took my wife and I out. We went looking at a lot of the dinosaur tracks in this area. And Glenn is quite an expert on the dinosaur tracks, particularly in this part of the world. And he has worked with a lot of more professional paleontologists, co-authored papers with them. And what he describes is 3 basic types of dinosaur tracks that are valid. We see 3-toed dinosaurs, like in the upper left over here, which is the theropods. These are meat-eating dinosaurs primarily. And we see their tracks very commonly. That's sort of what he's standing beside us. Large theropod dinosaur tracks. We also see sauropod dinosaur tracks. These are the large plant eaters. We see them very common in many places. But there's also another third type, which he refers to as the metatarsal dinosaur tracks. And these are dinosaurs who tended to at times walk a little bit different. Part of the time they would walk as normal 3-toed dinosaurs, but part of the time they would walk back on kind of the hind part of their foot in a strange way. And it's been misinterpreted to be for these to have been human tracks. So these are not human tracks, but they've been misinterpreted to be that. And you'll find that online. And we also find some as in the lower right here, which are things which have been carved by humans. So the origin of those is something that humans have been involved in. Humans didn't make the tracks in terms of walking. Humans made the tracks in terms of carving. And so they're fakes. Now, a lot of young Earth creationist organizations recognize this and recommend not using this as an argument, but you'll find it online. You'll find a Young Earth Creation Museum up in Glen Rose, which promotes this type of idea, and in fact has this particular dinosaur track in it. The track is known as the Burdick track, and you can see that it's been sawed. There's a saw mark across it, and it includes some different errors that make it also confirm that this is not a human track. And apparently it was carved by a man by the name of George Adams back in the 30s. He carved this out, and he would sell these type of tracks, these either human tracks or dinosaur tracks, which they're actually were carved things. One of the red flags is the fact that it's out on this loose piece of rock, as opposed to being in the rock itself. And when we look at it in more detail, this shows that carved piece, but it's been turned upside down. There are some convex upward type of shapes kind of discernible in it. Those convex upward shapes are from stromatolites. They were convex upward, just as they're growing today in the example over on the left, because here, this is from Australia, and they're always this convex upward shape. What Mr. Adams apparently did was he liked to carve on the bottoms of the rock, because the bottoms of the rock were a little flatter and easier to carve on, and he carved the foot into those. But this is simply a fake. That doesn't prove that young Earth creation is wrong. It says this is not an argument for young Earth creation. Let's take a look at some other tracks. And for those, we'll go up into Utah. We're going to look in Utah at some in an area called the Book Cliffs. It was described by a man by the name of John Balsey. I had a field trip with him back in the 80s, and we drove around, and he kept describing these tracks to us. And so I've taken his article, and we'll show some exhibits from it. They come from coal mines up there. And what the coal miners would do is they would mine out the coal, but oftentimes there would be a layer of silt up near the top of the mine. And so they mine out the coal from underneath it, and they could look up at the top, and they found some very interesting features up in the top of that. Those have been described by Dr. Balsey. And what you see in the center here is a map of one of these mines. And you see coal pillars layered in the kind of the gray areas. But where they mined it out, and you look up at the top, you see all of these blue things on it are actually dinosaur tracks. And you see examples of those on the left and on the right that are found there. And these come from the Black Hawk Formation there. This is in the Upper Cretaceous. You find dinosaur tracks. And you also find all of this petrified wood, the little brown pieces that are on this. And then you also find these tree roots from the trees that were growing at the time. So it's hard for me to imagine that you could have, this is the last part of the global flood. You had trees that were growing up apparently almost instantaneously. You had dinosaurs out walking around. This makes a lot more sense. It's basically kind of an ancient dinosaur feedlot. And the dinosaurs were wandering around in this swamp area, and they were eating the plants eating the leaves of the vegetation off of these trees and leaving their tracks. Another type of indication that's hard to account for in a flood model is shown in this slide. What we see are desiccation cracks or mud cracks that formed when the sediment was exposed for a period of time, began to dry out by these crinkly parts that just like you can walk on today oftentimes, and you'll feel them crinkle beneath your feet. In this case, though, they were being broken by dinosaurs who are walking along here. And that's what you see is two dinosaur tracks in this mud crack sediment. How does that work as a part of a flood? Especially if it's at the very peak of the flood, as Dr. Clary had, but even late in the flood, as some of the other models would predict. That's something that just doesn't fit in there. There's too many events taking place, too little time for them all to occur. You can't have trees growing to be full grown, and you can't have dinosaurs walking around, and particularly out on mud cracks. So again, key points on this. Dinosaur tracks just are not found with human prints. some of what's reported are fakes. Some are those which have been misidentified. The dinosaurs have walked in ways that were leaving tracks that can look human at times. And there's also this difficult for the young Earth creationists to reconcile how at the peak of the flood you had dinosaurs walking around in swamps with trees full grown and with tracks out on these ancient mud cracks. It just doesn't fit. Another point which young Earth creationists oftentimes use is they point to recent discoveries of soft tissue. If you remember the movie Jurassic Park, you remember that dinosaurs were supposed to have been cloned from dinosaur blood that had been caught up with mosquitoes and ancient tree resin called amber. And they were able to take this and grow entire dinosaurs with it. This brought up a storm of questions for paleontologists and biologists to answer. Could this happen? Could you go back and do this? Would you be able to reconstruct the DNA and find soft tissue from these ancient dinosaurs? The answer was almost always given no. It could not happen. You could not preserve DNA or soft tissue for millions of years. It's probably solved the problem of getting asked questions that they didn't want to deal with in any detail. But giving such a firm answer sometimes causes problems because sometimes that firm answer turns out to be not as correct as you thought it was. For instance, in this case, in 2005, a lady by the name of Mary Schweitzer announced the discovery of soft tissues, including apparently blood cells, and certainly things which preserve the shape of ancient blood in tissues from Tyrannosaurus rex, of all things. Fits perfectly with the Jurassic Park model. Mary Schweitzer is an evangelical Christian, and she was doing her dissertation, working with a man by the name of Jack Horner, who's a renowned expert in dinosaurs. She came across these things in what is apparently soft tissue and preserved these blood cells, took it to her boss and said, "What's going on? This can't be blood cells. But what is it?" And he turned it back to her and said, "Okay, you proved that it's not blood cells." And she couldn't do it. And she's since reported all kinds of soft tissue type of finds apparently from dinosaur bones. An amazing type of work. So again, I want to show how these fit into the stratigraphic column, particularly on the conventional geology side, which is supposed to be millions of years old. What we find are amphibian bones from the Permian period, the oldest period here with these stars on it from amphibians there. And this would be around 250 million years old in conventional measures of time. We also see dinosaur tissue that's been recovered from dinosaurs all the way through the Mesozoic, the period of the dinosaurs, and also some from the Eocene period, so on a younger period of time, from fish. So how could that happen? This is very, very surprising to conventional geologists to see this. What are the claims? Young Earth creationists are saying, well, soft tissue can't be preserved for millions of years. You told us this. They're saying the experts have already ruled on that. And yet we find soft tissue in rocks that's conventionally dated to be millions of years old. Therefore, the rocks can't be millions of years old. And most of those rocks must have been deposited during Noah's flood. How do we relate to that? Let's take a look at more on some of these claims. This is from some work by a group called the Dinosaur Soft Tissue Research Institute. And these guys have some experts, particularly Mark Armitage, who's very much of an expert in electron microscopy. He's finding remnants of soft tissue and certainly things that look to be very amazingly well-preserved tissue from, in this case, from Triceratops, from a Triceratops horn. He's gone in and looked at that and you see amazing, beautiful preservation of material, at least preserves the shape of ancient material. Whether it's the actual material or not, or whether it's been altered, is somewhat open to question. In this case, what is on the left, what we see is, again, a bone nerve harvested from that same triceratops there, and it shows a classic cross-hatching that you would expect to see in that type of tissue. And then you see the same thing, same type of cross-hatching in the Permian example, coming from one of the amphibians out of the Permian period. So what's happening there? How can you do that? How can you actually preserve this type of thing from dinosaurs? How could you preserve it for a few thousand years, let alone for millions of years? In fact, and the quote here is that the fact that any soft tissue is present in a heavily fossilized horn specimen suggests a selective fossilization process or sequestration. And material sequestered from deep tissues as a result of deep mineralization of the outer bone, allowing you to sequester to isolate parts of the inner bone. That brings up some interesting questions. How long can soft tissue be preserved if it is sequestered and isolated within a bone? And we don't have an answer to that. The young Earth creationists would say that, well, it's been preserved for 4,000 years. Can it be preserved for much longer than that? And if so, how? We know that chemical preservation takes place under a lot of different things, and it varies very widely depending on very specific conditions. What are we finding? We see these microscopic fragments that are deep inside bones, and they require very special treatment to recover. So until these type of methods of treating the bones were actually learned, no one predicted or expected to find any of these things. Some of these have been altered, at least chemically, and there are still scientists who are very skeptical that these are actual tissue fragments. And perhaps they're right. But I think the majority have come along to say that this probably is preserving the form, if not the actual tissue, from ancient, very, very ancient microscopic remains. How did it happen? How would it happen? We don't know the details on that. It's uncertain, but there are some things that we're beginning to learn. This has happened over the last, say, 15 years. From Reasons to Believe, Pascal Rana has put out a book called Dinosaur Blood and the Age of the Earth. And in it, he has described a whole bunch of different types of things which play into preserving this type of material. For instance, you have to have mineral-rich waters which come in and provide some sort of means of fossilization. And that has to happen pretty quickly. The burial conditions have to be important in that. Sometimes it needs to be very dry and hydrous type of conditions. Sometimes something has to actually sequester that soft tissue away from oxygen. Because if you had oxygen come in, then you would not have the preservation possible. It also has to be sequestered away or isolated away from environmental enzymes and microorganisms. If they got in, they would take care of that soft tissue very quickly. And so it's reported that iron plays a part in it. Temperature plays a role. pH plays a role. What minerals are present. These all are pieces of the pie, and they probably work in different ways at different times in different rocks. Very specific conditions are important. So the key points here, we do find there's microscopic fragments, soft tissue, and even fragments of DNA appear to be real. Particularly within bones, portions are isolated or sequestered away from other influences. We couldn't demonstrate that they would be destroyed over millions of years if they're isolated in this way without testing the specific conditions that the different bones were actually preserved in. If you're going to look for the absolute age, you're going to have to go to something different. You're going to have to use a different tool to be able to understand how old things are. Are they thousands of years old or are they millions of years old? If you talk to a geologist and you ask him, how old is this rock? And you want years, you want to know how old it is in years, that age that he gives you is going to be something somewhere tied to radiometric dating, the decay of radioactive elements with time. So let's take a look at that. The radioactive decay is the start of a number of different means of dating things, because using radioactive decay from 40 different types of methods, We were able to use and date different types of material at the time. Not every type of rock is directly datable, but we're able to date many different types of materials using one of these 40 different methods. It's like there's 40 different clocks, all pointing to the fact that the Earth is ancient. And they're all relatively independent of one another. So let's look at what the young Earth creation claims are. They say that radiometric dating includes assumptions that make them invalid, but they're only invalid for older materials because radiometric radiocarbon dating actually is used and trustworthy for those that are more recent than that. An interesting way to do it. It's valid until it becomes a problem with your theology. They say that you can detect carbon-14 in diamonds and in coals, and that proves that those rocks are actually young. And we'll take a look at those claims. And then they say that there are invalid readings in many volcanic samples from recent volcanics, and that proves the radiometric dating is invalid. So we'll take a look at those two claims and see how they measure up. Let's understand a little bit about carbon-14 dating. We have a lot of nitrogen in the atmosphere, but it reacts with cosmic radiation to give carbon-14. Carbon-14 ends up being breathed in along with a lot of carbon-12 into plants that are living. And that's something that's at a very consistent type of rate, and we can use that as a basis to date things. But the ratio between the carbon-14 and the carbon-12 is very consistent while the plant is living. But then when the plant dies, then part of that carbon-14 begins to break down. It actually goes back to a nitrogen-14. But it breaks down. It decays at a very constant type of rate. Like all radioactive decay, you can measure it, think of it in terms of half-lives. A half-life forms because initially you had all the carbon-14, but if you take it one half-life later, 5,730 years later, you actually have half the amount of carbon-14 because a lot of it has already gone to nitrogen-14. You go another half-life, another 5,730 years, now you would have only 25% of it. And if you go another half-life, you'd have just 12.5%. But eventually you're going to run out of carbon-14 atoms. And eventually that's all going to be decayed away. And really in terms of what geologists believe about geologic time, it's really not that long ago. And so you would not expect to see carbon-14 in rocks that is millions and billions of years old. So what do we find? This is some data that's in a table by Dr. Clary in his book, Carved in Stone. And it takes some data for a series of diamonds that are conventionally dated at being billions of years old. All these diamonds were from Africa. And these are but they're finding carbon-14 in the analysis on these. How can that be? All that carbon-14 should have gone away. All of that should be now nitrogen-14 and escaped off. How do you get carbon-14 preserved in these diamonds? This is used as evidence to say that these rocks can't be billions of years old, but actually just a few thousand years old. So let's take a look at that. How would you do that? How could that happen? Where could the carbon-14 detected in these ancient materials actually come from? A lot of it actually comes from contamination, and we'll show that in a few minutes. But there's also other sources. You can have carbon-14 that's being formed today in the laboratory due to this cosmic rays, which actually would come through and create new carbon-14. That's probably not the source of a lot of these types, but it could be in some cases. And when you have a lot of nitrogen in the material that's being dated, then we are not surprised to find that there's actually some carbon-14 that is formed from the decay of that nitrogen-14. And that's particularly true in the coals and in the oils from that. These are places where you have a lot of nitrogen in them. They're by definition that forms in hydrocarbons. So it's not surprising that you would see this in those. And so there's oftentimes a lot of uranium and thorium in the area, which can also excite the nitrogen-14, converting it into carbon-14. And so that makes sense that you would have some of that. So that probably explains some of the dating there. Well, what about the diamonds? Let's take a look at what this is theoretical data for carbon-14 decay. We're looking at what 1% contamination would tend to do. 1%, if you have only 1% contamination, that's a pretty clean sample. So if the actual age was 5,000, it might appear to be 4,850 years because there's contamination there. And that little bit of that appearing younger is a trend that continues all the way through. You see that even though the rock might be 100,000 years old at the base here, it would only appear to be 38,000 years, because all we would be seeing would be that little bit of contamination. When you date a sample that was 100,000 years old, you wouldn't find the carbon-14, but you would still find that 1% contamination. So now if we take that and we compare that, we'll take a look at the data from Dr. Clary that he gave us from the diamonds. So here are the diamond, some of the diamond data. It's plotted where we can plot the percent modern carbon. That's what he's giving us. And we relate that to the age. And this is from a Young Earth Creationist table. And what we see is dates that range from around 30,000 years, well, roughly, consistent with that 1% contamination, to those that are almost 70,000 years old. It's kind of an average at around 60,000 years. How do you get that? Why would you get that? 1% contamination would make it look to be 30,000 years old. What type of contamination would be needed to make it look like it is 60 or 70,000 years old? It's not really linear. Actually, those apparent ages actually could result from not 1% contamination, but 1,000 of 1% contamination. Just a very small piece of contamination will account for all of this data. No laboratory is going to be able to keep its instrument so clean that it can guarantee not to have 1,000% contamination. This is easily just an artifact of a tiny amount of contamination. And that's why we would never use carbon dating for material that would have that small an amount of carbon-14 in it. It's got to have more than that, or else it's just not statistically reasonable. It's beyond the limits of the instruments that we have. Let's take a look at some other evidence for carbon-14 dating. Why would we believe that it's true? And this is from an article put out by Greg Davidson and Ken Wogelmuth. And they basically look at tree ring data. You can count tree rings, and that's a very easy thing to count the number of tree rings. Some trees in particular are valuable because they give a very consistent type of tree rings per year. So they only have one tree ring per year. That's a consistent pattern in them. So those are the most reliable trees to use. And they'll also use something called varves. These are lake sediments. And lakes tend to turn once a year, so that will form two layers kind of in the year. It'll form a light layer and a dark layer. In this case, you'll see a series of light layers and dark layers. These are called varves. These are from lake sediments. So what happens when we compare those to carbon-14? First, we'll look at the tree ring count. And in the tree ring count, again, you see a very nice curve which shows that out to about 13,000 years, we can see a very nice trend where there is some uncertainty, but a very small uncertainty in terms of the age on these tree rings. So this seems to be a very, very consistent picture that the carbon-14, which is very independent of the tree ring count, are verifying one another. I can go in and look at how many tree ring counts we have and measure the age, or I can go to the carbon-14 and get the age from that, and it's a very consistent picture. What about the varves? This is data from Lake Sugetsu from Japan. And again, it shows a very consistent pattern, going back even farther. So it's going back to around 40,000 years, where you're able to see this very good pattern between the carbon-14 and the lake sediments and the carbon that's found in those. That's a great amount. That's great verification. The carbon-14 is giving us a good measure of time. Now, it's not perfect. There is uncertainty in it, but it's certainly good enough to show us that these age dates go way beyond the 6,000 years that might be predicted from a young Earth model. To summarize the carbon-14, I would say that carbon-14 can be detected in all carbonaceous material regardless of its origin. The measurements that we find from diamonds are consistent with very, very low levels of contamination. The higher concentrations that are reported in coals would result from other natural sources of carbon-14. And to me, the young Earth creationist still has to explain why you would have the carbon-14 techniques work so well in historic times, but suddenly become false when they get into the ancient times, those before 4,000 years before Christ. Another point that's interesting is from the standpoint of diamonds is you can also date not the diamonds themselves, but you can date some of the inclusions that are within them. And some of the iron sulfides within the diamond actually are dated using a technique called rhenium osmium dated, one of the 40 different techniques of radiometric dating. And if you date the diamonds this way, you actually get dates in the billions of years, just as we would expect geologically. So there's a consistent answer that way, and it's very believable. And I think that carbon-14 data holds up pretty well. So if radioisotopes and radiometric dating is telling us that the universe is very old, that the Earth is very old, this is an obvious challenge to young Earth creationists, and they recognize that challenge, and they put in a lot of effort into this. A key study was they performed a few years back, and it was called Radioisotopes in the Age of the Earth. So it's basically the RATE study, as it's referred to. And this was put out by several of the key people in the young Earth creation movement, Larry Vardaman and Andrew Snelling, for instance. This summarizes some of what really they came up with. After a lot of work, putting out a lot of documentation, what does it all come down to? Well, one thing they showed, this is summarized by Randy Isaac, they showed the fact that there is a lot of overwhelming evidence for at least more than 500 million years worth of radioactive decay on the Earth. I mean, the evidence is clear on that. But they say that the biblical interpretation and some of their studies say that the Earth is actually very young. So how do you put those together? Therefore, in their opinion, radioactive decay must have been accelerated, not just accelerated a little bit, but by a factor of 1 billion for the first 3 days of creation and during the flood. They had to do it in both times because those rocks, which they would describe the flood, also show evidence of that progressive radioactive decay. So this concept of accelerated decay does give at least two major scientific problems. One is the problem of heat, because radioactive decay generates a lot of heat, and it also generates a lot of extra radiation. But they believe that this will be resolved sometime in the future. That takes some faith to believe that, because they have a lot of faith in their interpretation, because certainly there's no evidence that there is some sort of explanation forthcoming otherwise. So they would say that on the basis of what they've seen, that this RATE project provides encouragement regarding the reliability of the Bible. I have no problem with the reliability of the Bible, but I don't think this RATE study helps very much. Let's look at some other things which are related to this. One of the things that they have found is that if you look at and date some recent lava flows, they can find some anomalous type of data out of it. So this is related to a study by Dr. Stephen Austin, which was run in 1996, in which he took some lava flows, they're called dacite flows, from a 1986 lava flow from Mount St. Helens. And in Mount St. Helens there, they were able to sample these flows and actually date the material in it using potassium argon dating. The strange thing is that you had these flows which clearly took place in 1986, and yet they were calculating dates of these, or ages of these, of being 35,000 to 2.8 million years old. So this is an obvious problem from the standpoint of an old Earth point, at least from their perspective it is. They would say, well, you can't have that type of thing. So it's obviously telling us that the radiometric dating is not working. How would we respond to that? What would we look at from an old Earth point of view? And when we look at this data, what would it tell us? Well, let's take a look at that. Well, how could that happen? Well, we know that some argon Okay. So the basic issue, as he describes in his title here, there's excess argon. So when potassium breaks down, eventually it leaves us with an inert gas of argon. And when it forms that argon, then the ratio of potassium to argon should give us some indication of the age. But in this case, apparently what was happening is they were finding much more argon in the lavas than there actually should be from the standpoint of radiometric dating. How would we explain that from the standpoint of an old Earth perspective? Well, let's take a look at that. We know that some argon is known to be incorporated into some recent lavas. There's excess argon there, and we understand the process that relates to that. So that's not something that is surprising. There's also the fact that there can be contamination. Just like in the diamonds that we were looking at, there can be some contamination, and that becomes an important part in this. These samples, the argon labs, because we can't date material. One problem that arises whenever you start dating recent lavas is that there can be contamination in those. In fact, the lab that Dr. Austin used would say that they cannot date material accurately that's less than 2 million years old. Does that mean that they're assuming that things have to be older than that? So that's a part of a flawed assumption. It's actually the fact that there's just not enough argon generated in that time period in less than 2 million years for them to be able to see it as to give valid results. In other words, instruments can carry argon from a previous test, and they find that little bit of contamination is not a problem for older material because there's more argon generated over longer periods of time. But for shorter periods of time, it's just not enough there. And there's also the fact that they recognize that you can have some lithic material incorporated into the test that they're running, and that will give wrong type of test. And there's also the fact that there can be zonation of what are called phenocrysts. Phenocrysts are material that's incorporated into the recent lava flow. And those dates might even actually be approximately correct for this. Now, in the upper right here, you see a picture that shows some phenocrysts. Basically, they're incorporated. These are crystals, so that the black material around the crystals in here is actually the recent material, but it's all obviously incorporating material that is from an older flow. And these are the phenocrysts, and that's part of the material that they're dating. And you see that they're zoned. You see a black center in some of them, and you'll see bands out from that. Those dark centers actually formed much earlier than the outer material. So the test that he was given probably incorporated some very much older material, and so the overall average may have been fairly reasonable that way, but it's just not valid for testing what they were trying to test, not valid for other things. So let's take a look at some other tests that have been run on other lava flows from Mount St. Helens. And what they did was they actually dated just the phenocrysts themselves, not the overall whole rock type analysis, such as Stephen Austin was trying to test. And he found that some of these came from much older lava flows, and as much as 20 to 40% was from other flows as well. So what they were saying is they could test just the individual crystals, and in those crystals, they found that these came from much older flows. And that's probably what Dr. Austin was testing in his. And so that's not a surprise that you would get older type of dates in recent flows. Does that mean that these type of tests are not valid, that you cannot use them, if there's no way to date more recent flows? Not at all. This is some work that Brett Dalrymple has presented, and it's from material dating things from the Mount Vesuvius eruption that took place, and we know when it took place, in August 24th, 79 AD. That was over 1900 years ago. And what they did was they separated out the crystals within this, the sanidine crystals, and they actually did dating on just those. And when they dated those, they found that the isochron date, the technique they used, gave a date of 1925 years before the test was run in 1997. Well, that's just 7 years different from the actual age they knew from history. again, a very accurate test. And so Dalrymple summarizes what we know from historic lava flows. So the basic it says that the large majority of the historic lava flows that have been studied either give correct ages or as expected, or sometimes they have some excessive argon in them. And we mentioned the fact that we understand that there can be argon trapped inside lava, particularly those underwater. Oftentimes they've been able to correct those for that excess lava, and they get very reasonable, very correct type of dates. This is just saying that, again, radiometric dating is giving really good dates. It can give good dates. It can give very bad dates, but we can understand why those bad dates would be found. And we understand that that process is not telling us that the process doesn't work, but it is telling us that we have to be careful at how we use it. Key points are that basically the reported potassium argon dating of recent volcanic rocks are very consistent with what you would expect from either contamination or from incorporating some older material into that recent lava flow. But actually, other techniques, argon dates, often reflect very accurate dating for historic lava flows. And oftentimes, if they don't, they can be corrected to show what those dates should be. We're going to look at another aspect of radiometric dating. And here we want to take a look at plate tectonics. I think most of you are aware that our globe is divided up into a series of large plates, which are always moving, and we can measure the movement of these with time. And let's take a look at how that relates to age dating. Young Earth creationists are also recognized that plate tectonics is one of the has been active over time, although their idea of how much time it has acted over and what rate it has moved at is very different than what conventional geology would say, and most of science would tell us. They've come up with a model which is called catastrophic plate tectonics. It's been put out by a number of different authors, such as John Baumgartner, who has devised some computer models, which he said he believes support this. It's also put out and written up by people like Stephen Austin, Andrew Snelling, Dr. Tim Ferry, and many other young Earth creationists with some geologic training. So let's take a look at that, how that relates. Young Earth creationists claim that, of course, radiometric dating isn't valid, and they would say that the plate tectonic movements, the plates are moving as a result of runaway subduction and superfall. What this results in is continents that are moving at rates of meters per second. Now, that's pretty amazing that they would be moving at that. You know, what we see right now in plates, as we measure them, they're actually moving at rates of centimeters per year. So meters per second is a very rapid type of rate. They say that these superfalls resulted in vast numbers of tsunamis, and that's what brought water up onto the continents during Noah's flood. And they would say that large animals survived the flood by migrating to high grounds. And so that's why they would say that you have dinosaurs and mammal fossils higher up in the flood rather than lower in the flood. So let's take a look at some of this. Let's see what we actually see in the data. Now, this is a map which shows the age of the crust based on radiometric dating, and it's been mapped across the world, and it shows a beautiful pattern. For instance, if you will look between North America and Africa, you'll see that there's a series of blue bands near the coast. Those are the older crust, and it gets younger and younger as it comes toward the center, towards what's called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which runs all the way from South America all the way up to the North Pole area. And it runs right through Iceland and that. And there's actually, as you know, there's a lot of volcanic activity today. But you see this type of consistent pattern all over the earth. And this is consistent with respect to radiometric dating, and it's consistent with respect to the type of sedimentation that we find, and with respect to the biostratigraphy, with respect to microfossils and the way they have developed over time. So let's take a look further. And this is a map of Pangaea, when all of the continents were back together in the early Triassic period. You in young Earth creationists would also put them together in the Triassic period. Conventional geology would say that's taking place at 237 million years ago. So how does this relate? Well, let's take a look at some work that Sean Ovis has done. And he points out that if you can move the continents at meters per second, and as opposed to the rate that we see them moving at today, you're going to generate a lot of heat. There's a lot of kinetic motion, kinetic energy that's involved in doing that. Because if you're going to increasing the rate by a factor of over 3 billion, then that kinetic energy is going to go up much, much higher than that at a rate of more like 10 to the 19th power. But let's say, regardless of how you get them going, what happens whenever you begin to stop them? Just like when you're driving down a mountain, you start applying your brakes. Sometimes the brakes will get very hot, begin to smoke. We had this experience in Colorado a number of times that way. Sean points out that stopping a continental plate moving at meters per second would generate phenomenal amounts of heat, quite enough heat to have melted the plates. Obviously, the plates haven't melted at that. They didn't melt during this period of time, so we don't see any evidence of that type of heat. So this says that this really didn't happen. I want to show a couple of other examples of how radiometric dating relates to this. We could go to Hawaii if you'd like a field trip there. I highly recommend that. But here's some data from Hawaii. But to show the mapping on this shows the Hawaiian Islands, and there's a chain of volcanic islands and volcanic seamounts that goes all the way up to the Aleutian Islands, called the Hawaiian Ridge and the Emperor Seamount chain. And if we look at those in terms of radiometric dating, then what you would find is the oldest dates are up near the Aleutian Islands, up around 80 million years, and they progressively and systematically change. You get towards Hawaii, 0 million years. So you're seeing things going 80, 60, 56, 49, 47, 28. Very systematic changes in the age of these different islands, these different seamounts. And you notice that there's a bend in those. That bend is very consistent with the type of predictions you would have as you move the plate tectonic plates, and you see that they will have that kink of where they changed in their motion at that time. And it dates to the right period of time. So that's a very consistent story that's telling us that the radiometric dating on these is actually working. It gives us a consistent picture that supports the movement of these plates with time. I want to look at one other example of this. We're going to go into the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula, as it's moving in and colliding with Eurasia. The collision generates the Zagros Mountains and several other mountain ranges in there. We have GPS measurements along these. They show that this was moving that this plate is moving today at a rate of 20 millimeters per year or 2 centimeters per year. And so that's a type of rate that is much slower than what young Earth models would say that they'd moved at in the past. But it's interesting that as you date that and move that past back, that's very consistent with what we see in the rock record in terms of the geology that's formed in here. And it allows us to extrapolate. It's kind of interesting from the standpoint of Genesis, because what it does, you see Mount of Ararat is right in this area. So it was built up as a result of this collision. Because it also relates to Genesis 2, because in Genesis 2, we have some description of where the Garden of Eden was located. And there are 4 rivers which are given, 2 of which are the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And they fall in this Mesopotamian valley, in this area where these plates were moving. Tigris and Euphrates rivers mentioned, and also the Assyrian nation, and Assyria is related to this in Damascus, and you see that in the area of Syria today. So this all kind of dates things into the period of time when the plates were already kind of in place. What we see is if you were to dig down below the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in this Mesopotamian region, you would find that there's a lot of rocks in there. In fact, there's about 4 miles worth of rock down below these rivers that is made up of limestones and dolomites and shales and all types of rocks that we expect to be forming at reasonable geologic type of rates. They're consistent with that. And then on top of these would have been the Garden of Eden. So how does that work? Let's see. What we have is the Garden of Eden on top of these rocks, and then these rocks deposited later by the flood. That's an obvious problem that way, and it can't work. Henry Morris would have said, well, these names for these rivers didn't really refer to these rivers that we see today, but some sort of pre-flood river that could have been anywhere. So the Garden of Eden could have been located anywhere in the world. And then the people just decided to name these rivers later after the earlier rivers. But there's really no indications of that, and very few biblical scholars would support that type of conclusion. Kind of in summary on this, key points from this part is the fact that radiometric dating on the oceanic crust shows a very systematic pattern that's very consistent with expected movements. The young Earth models would have actually melted the plates. GPS rates that we see today are consistent with the biostratigraphic dating and the radiometric dating that we had, and all that type of material, so it gives a consistent picture. And also, flood geology just doesn't account for the fact that Genesis references the Tigris and the Euphrates River, which are on top of flood sediments in the young Earth model. So all of this is to say that basically the young Earth arguments that are being presented, showing that the Earth is young, are really not supported. They are tied to some various contamination issues, problems like that. Are valid arguments for a young Earth. We've looked at a few lines of evidence that are given by young Earth creationists to say that science supports their particular interpretation of Scripture on Genesis and on creation. But every time I've investigated a young Earth claim, I've found other explanations which provide very good reason to believe that their claims are invalid. Again, I want to emphasize that what I'm saying is I'm questioning the science that are presenting, and I would question their interpretation of Genesis. I'm not questioning their relationship with God or their relationship that way. This is a discussion between Christians, and hopefully can be able to be held in a loving manner. Science can learn us a lot about how magnificent God is, but it doesn't bring us into a relationship with Him. Now, the next slide kind of shows a little bit of what the perspective needs to be for this. God created the entire natural world, and He's given us the ability to study that world and learn more about His work. But we should never worship that. As this slide says, for what does it profit a man if he learns all of geology and knows the ages of all rocks, if he does not know Jesus, the rock of all ages? I can be very correct in my science. I can be very correct in my conclusions for a lot of things this way, but it would be very hollow if I've missed out on the actual creator of the universe. Jesus is referred to by Christians as being the rock of all ages, and we're told to build our life on the rock. The rock formation that you see here is from Carlsbad Caverns in Carlsbad, New Mexico, and this particular stalagmite has been named the Rock of Ages. And it probably formed over many, many thousands of years, but that's just a fraction of what God, the Ancient of Days, has existed for, and will continue to exist for. And after this is long gone, God will still be there, and Jesus will still be the rock of all ages. And Christians certainly should unite in that aspect, if they do differ on some other aspects. He is the rock that we build our lives on. Thank you for listening.